Hello and welcome back to Litcast. In this episode we're going to be exploring the biography of JB Priestley and the context surrounding an inspector calls. Let's get into it. Alright, this is going to be a pretty dense episode. There's going to be quite a lot of information here. So what I would recommend is that you pause it regularly, but it's going to be chunked up into the different sections of context. Pause it regularly and just give yourself a chance to make some notes or just kind of go through some of those key points that we explore. So let's start with the biography of JB Priestley. So John Priestley, was born in Bradford in 1894. His mother was a former mill worker and his father was a schoolmaster, and that inspired him to develop a social conscience. He wrote a regular column for the Bradford Pioneer. He wasn't paid for that, it was voluntary, and he aired his opinions there on topics such as music and film, as well as arguing against the imminent war. When we say arguing against, that's talking about reasons why it shouldn't go ahead rather than reasons why it's not happening, which is what Mr. Birling does. The First World War, so 1914 to 1918, then had a huge impact on him. He volunteered for the army and he served on the Western Front. And that's actually where you can talk to your history teachers about this. Some of the most appalling loss of life occurred. So he was very, very much in the throes of the action of the First World War, and that would have inevitably impacted him. Although many of his friends were killed in action, Priestley survived injury and emerged from his experience with a deep loathing of the class system, which in wartime expressed itself in the gulf between officers and ordinary soldiers. So quite often, if you were from the middle or upper classes, you could just automatically be sort of put in the position of officer, and ordinary soldiers would have been on the front line. So as kind of a lower class, you were automatically sort of put more in harm's way, perhaps, than an officer who, simply because they were of a different class, were perhaps considered to have the ability to strategize around war and things like that. So Priestley studied modern history and political science at Cambridge, and wrote extensively on social issues about the plight of the poor and the unemployed. And he actually wrote quite a few different plays, not just an Inspector Calls. He wrote around 40 plays in total in his lifetime, and some of them include things like Time in the Conways, I've Been Here Before, Dangerous Corner, and An Inspector Calls. So in these particular plays that I've mentioned, Priestley explores various contemporary theories about time. Priestley became a popular public figure and supported the United Nations that were formed in 1945 following the Second World War. And the whole idea of the United Nations is preventing further wars between countries and offering that chance, that sort of forum for discussion between nations of the world. And then he also strongly supported the National Health Service. So the National Health Service was introduced by the Labour government. There's a recent play about this called Nye, about Aneurin Bevan, who's a Welshman who very much pioneered this idea, and they brought about the National Health Service in 1948, and this provided free medical care for all British citizens. So before that, you would have had to pay privately for healthcare. So even though you were too poor to afford it, you still would have had to pay for that healthcare and get billed. If you think about kind of the American healthcare system, it wasn't quite the same as that, but it's a similar principle. So throughout his life, Priestley was a strong voice and a strong believer in the importance of shared social responsibility. Although Priestley declined the offer of a knighthood and a peerage, he accepted the Order of Merit in 1977. And that was awarded personally by the Queen. He then died in 1984. So have a think about the biography of Priestley and think about how perhaps some of those key moments in his life, those key aspects of his life, perhaps translated to some of the decisions to include various aspects of characters or quotes or mentions of things in An Inspector Calls. Let's look at the historical and cultural context now. So Priestley wrote an Inspector Calls, as we know, in 1945, and he wrote it for a post-war audience. And this is really important to remember, that the audience is post-war and lots of things are already sort of set in motion. So we know, thinking about the dates that we talked about before, the United Nations would have been just founded or being in the process of being founded. There would be talks already about the National Health Service in anticipation of it being introduced in 1948. So lots of societal shift happening. However, the action of the play is set on a spring evening in 1912. So the contrast of the way people lived in 1912 and the way they lived in 1945 was crucial in creating some of the effects within the play. And the context of the play is very, very important to the understanding of it as a result. The play is set at the close of the Edwardian era, and it's seen from a post-Second World War perspective. The action of the play is located in a fictional industrial city in the North Midlands. So Priestley calls this Brumley. However, the play itself takes place in the Burlings dining room, and the audience only sees wealthy characters. Now, depending, I think we've mentioned this in previous episodes, depending on the version that you see or the performance style that you see, quite often these characters are kind of locked away in a doll's house style set, and then the door opens, so we're kind of allowed in. So quite often you will see sort of the streets or a street outside the Burlings household. This isn't written into the stage directions, but quite often it's used to sort of show the juxtaposition, that stark spatial contrast between the streets and then this little world that they've created for themselves inside their house. So we see only wealthy characters, and aside from the inspector, of course. And this regional urban setting is important in helping the audience to imagine the slum-like conditions that 20th century workers and the unemployed might have to live in. And that's why quite often you'll see directors use extras, non-speaking characters outside of the Burling household to kind of contextualize where this house is, and the fact they might have this little fairy tale for themselves, but actually outside life is harsh and life is hard. And if you've seen the BBC televised version, the most recent BBC televised version of An Inspector Calls, they again kind of go beyond the stage directions to really contextualize for us as an audience what life is like outside of the Burling household. So they essentially act out the memories that each of the characters talk about. So we get to see Eva Smith go through each of these ordeals. And maybe for a modern audience like us, where we're even more detached, the war isn't fresh in our minds, maybe that kind of gives us again that real sense of that contrast between what life was like for someone like Eva Smith and what life was like for the Burlings. In the 33 years between 1912 and 1945, there was significant societal change, and the most significant changes were more than likely brought about by 2 world wars. I mean, it's kind of obvious that society is going to change with conflict of that magnitude. Now, both world wars caused millions of deaths and injuries to British servicemen and women, and as well as that to countless civilians. And this shared experience of war that transcends class, that goes beyond class. It wasn't just like the working classes experienced war or the middle classes experienced war. Everyone experienced war in some way. And this caused a change in attitudes towards the class system. The class system was really dominant in Edwardian society in the years leading up to the wars, but that system of hierarchy and social privilege was no longer accepted as the only possible structure for society. The face of industry was also transformed by the increasing numbers of women in the workforce and the formation, crucially, of trade unions, which gave employees more power to negotiate fair pay and better working conditions. So the main purpose for setting An Inspector Calls in 1912 is to allow the audience to see just how wrong Burling is in his predictions for the future. The fact he's so blinkered about the times that he lives in suggests that his judgment is not to be trusted in other areas, and it undermines his authority if we're watching as a post-war audience. So the 1945 audience would appreciate things like Burling saying these silly little war scares would have been forgotten, or how wrong he is about the Titanic being unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. So let's talk a bit more about social class. So at the beginning of the 20th century, society was divided unequally into recognisable classes. And you can almost kind of see this as a pyramid with royalty at the top, followed by aristocracy, upper classes, right down, through the upper middle, lower middle, working classes. Then you've got the labouring classes underneath the working classes. So whereas working class might include people like shop workers or medical staff like nurses, the labouring class was seen as the workers in the mines, the mills, the factories, the farms, that grueling, repetitive work that now has been much more industrialized, so lots of that sort of work that might be done by machines now, and they're only just above the vagrant class, which would include the homeless, prostitutes, petty criminals. So really kind of stark contrast there, and that stark hierarchy forms the basis for a lot of the interactions in an inspector calls. So Burling is presented as this successful, wealthy industrialist, and he's married a woman who is his social superior, which means he's elevated himself that little bit further as well. We learn that Gerald's mother, Lady Croft, comes from an old country family with landed people, which is one of the reasons why Burling is so pleased with his future son-in-law. You can kind of see this as a good match from a societal perspective, because again it's elevating the family's class. It also explains why he is anxious to be granted a knighthood, because it helps the family again a little further up the social ladder. So this is something you can see that is very, very important to people. Burling's sensitivity about his social class, coupled with Mrs. Burling's insistence on appropriate etiquette, so good manners, good behaviour, reflects the importance of the class structure in 1912. So the Crofts don't attend the engagement party, they just send a very nice cable, and that suggests, as Burling admits privately, that they feel Gerald may have done better for himself socially. So Gerald is marrying down here. While the Burlings are acutely aware their lower social status in relation to the Crofts is potentially an issue, they are nevertheless very comfortable with displaying their superiority over others. And perhaps it's a case that because they're not right up at the top of those upper classes, that's why they feel the need to flaunt their status, because they're aware that they're not right at the top, but they want to very clearly distinguish themselves from the lower classes. Burling's really keen to impress upon the inspector, even before the investigation begins, that he's been an alderman for years. Remember, an alderman is someone who's quite high up in a council. And he's been Lord Mayor for 2 years as well, and that he's still on the bench, so he's a magistrate. And at the time, people in his position would be used to settle small cases in court. So all of that is to demonstrate his superiority over ordinary citizens. And he also shows his contempt for the workforce, not only in the way he treats them, in such as refusing to consider the higher wage request, but also in the way he speaks about his employees. He demonstrates a clear them and us mentality. This idea that if you don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'll soon be asking for the earth. Gerald is just as disparaging when he comments on the workers' strike, observing, if it was just after the holidays, they'd all be broke if I know them. So you can see that there's a definite them and us situation, and that attitude generally kind of speaks to this idea that they do think that they're somehow less than them. Mrs. Burling is a really key example of this. She's really contemptuous of the lower classes, and she seems to almost view them as a separate species, as subhuman. She suggests that she doesn't suppose for a moment that we can understand why the girl committed suicide, and she often refers to Eva as one of the girls of that class. And she admits that she decided to block Eva's appeal for assistance, partly because Eva appeared to be claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position. So we can see girls of that class, girls in her position. So lumping them all together, despite individual circumstances leading to them being where they are. She's putting all of these girls together. And this idea of claiming elaborate, fine feelings. You see the words elaborate and fine. She's sort of using words that perhaps belong to, or would often be used within the middle and upper classes, to highlight the fact that they're almost feelings that Eva's not allowed to have, that they don't, but those words don't belong to her. She shouldn't be using those. She's trying to claim them for herself, but she's not allowed them. It's not her place. And really, the character most acutely aware of social distinction is Mrs. Burling. Now, this could simply be because she's the highest ranking in terms of class, maybe aside from Gerald, but in terms of the Burling family, she's the highest ranking in class. But it could also be that she is maybe a little bit conscious of the fact that she has married below her station and therefore desperately wants to cling on to that class that she's grown up with, that she knows, and she wants to, rather than kind of being brought down to Mr. Burling's class, she wants to drag everyone up with her and keep them up there. So she's very acutely aware of what is socially acceptable, the appropriate etiquette, the appropriate manners. So she criticises Mr. Burling when he says about thanking the cook, or when he wants to talk to or he mentions kind of talking to Edna and things as well. So that's not appropriate. She also doesn't like Sheila's use of slang. Later in the play, she's outraged because she feels the inspector is impertinent in the way that he conducts his inquiry. So she is, if you're looking for someone to talk about as someone who embodies this rigid, outdated class system, Mrs. Burling is the person to look at. In contrast to Gerald and the Burlings, the inspector, however, champions the poor. He's that very strong contrast. So he really supports the poor, and one of his main functions in the play is to try and teach the Burlings, and at the same time the audience, some compassion for human beings, and disregarding class completely, just thinking about everyone as being human beings, being responsible for each other. We are members of one body, we are responsible for each other. A very Christian sentiment and a very socialist sentiment. Early on in the investigation, he tells Sheila it would do us all a bit of good if sometimes we tried to put ourselves in the place of these young women, counting their pennies in their dingy little back bedrooms. So although the inspector is speaking in 1912, the audience he was addressing belonged to 1945. So his words act as Priestley's warning. The inspector is often described as Priestley's mouthpiece. They work as Priestley's warning to them not to allow these old class divisions and these old ways of thinking to destroy this prospect of greater equality in a post-war nation. So if you think about it, 1945, the two world wars have just happened. We've seen this disillusionment when it comes to the class system and lots of the ways of thinking that Mr. Burling has. And that's that tipping point. It could slowly sort of creep back to how it was in 1912, or this could be a real opportunity for major change. So it would be wrong to suggest that the class system of the early 20th century no longer existed by 1945. There was still a class system. However, that rigid structure, for a number of reasons, had eroded over the years. So financial implications of managing a large household, the fact that many people had died, and therefore the idea of this family lineage that was important to the class system, that was broken a little, because in particular sons who carry the family name would potentially not have come back from the war. And as well as that, there was a change in sentiment, a change in feeling. So immediately after the Second World War, there was this great feeling of solidarity. There was a population that had united together, and the class system wasn't so important. So in the First World War, the class system, Priestley had personal experience of the class system becoming an issue, where middle class and upper class men were drafted in to become officers and were kept away from the front lines. But by the time we got to 1945, that was less rigid, and as well, people fighting in the trenches due to necessity against each other, kind of alongside each other of different classes meant that there was this shared understanding and shared experience of the war. And no matter what your life was like up to that point, once you have that profound shared experience, it means that you're going to have a connection that is perhaps more important than that class system. We've touched on this in other areas, but let's have a look at political change as well. So in the first post-war general election in 1945, the Labour Party were voted into power. They had this huge boost in popularity. And the Conservative Party, who were represented by Winston Churchill, were voted out. Voters were influenced by the expectation that the Labour Party would adopt ideas for social reform. Social reform is a term used to describe changes to improve the conditions in which people live and work. So quite an idealistic proposal. And that had been put forward by William Beveridge. So the Beveridge report that was published in 1942 formed the basis for a manifesto for change. So a manifesto is a published statement and it outlines kind of political plans for change. And in this case, it was around this social reform, so improving living conditions. And what it described was plans to ensure better housing, free medical treatment, and pushing for employment for all. So far from being a period where, as Berling predicts in Act 1, the interests of capital are properly protected, when Priestley wrote the play, it was obvious that it was the rights of labour that would be the chief concern of the new government. So looking after the workers rather than the owners. Audiences at the time would see Berling's self-assurance as misguided because they're living through something very different to what he's predicting. And modern audiences can also see some of the short-sightedness of Berling's confident pronouncements. So let's explore the exploitation of workers, and then we'll look at women in particular kind of after this. So linked to the class issue is Priestley's depiction of the ways in which the lower classes were exploited by their employers. So Eva Smith is the main representative of the exploited worker. She is a good worker. She is described as a good worker in Act 1 by Mr. Berling, and she was actually so good she was about to be promoted to a leading operator. So she's very good at her job. But Eva was sacked from Berling and Company for being a ringleader who started the trouble that led to the strike. Significantly, at a time where female employees had no voice or representation in the workforce, Berling criticises Eva for having a lot to say, far too much. And he concludes, so she had to go. In 1912, the cheapest labour available to industrialists like George Croft and Arthur Berling would have been women. Priestley doesn't consider it necessary to specify what was made in the Berling's works, but it was probably something related to textiles, given the large number of women employed. But he's very specific about what the workers earned. They were averaging about 22 and 6. So just to give you an idea as to how much 22 and 6 is, because it's quite difficult to convert it into modern money, although there's lots of calculators that will do that for you. If you think about a lady's hat that Sheila might have bought in Millwoods, or that Mrs. Berling might have worn when she was telling Eva where to go when she came to ask for help, that hat would have likely cost more than 30 shillings. So 22 and 6 wouldn't have bought you a hat. And just to kind of put that in perspective, if you think about the differences, it's the stark differences between the money that the classes had and how much they had to work for them. So in addition to employing women in his factory, Mr. Berling, as well as, any wealthy householder of the time, would have had domestic staff. So we know that he's got Edna, who's the parlour maid. We see her, and we also know that they keep a cook. And Mr. Berling is told off for complimenting the cook or sending compliments down to the cook. And this was really normal for families like the Berlings in 1912. But Priestley still suggests that Edna may be being exploited when Mrs. Berling assumes in Act 3 that however late, Edna will still answer the door. So she says, I asked her to wait up to make us some tea. So that emphasises the fact that the Berlings always put their own comfort before the welfare of their domestic staff. Because remember, that's a job. She's potentially doesn't live in the home. So is literally waiting really late into the evening just to sort of wait on them beyond when perhaps her shift would normally finish. Another little note about the setting is thinking about each of the stories from the Burling family and how that relates to where they live. So in Brumley, we see opportunities for employment in the factories, and then the town has shops that cater to the rich. But think about the fact that the employment there, any employment of any kind, is dependent on whatever the factory bosses want and the shop's rich customers. Think about the authority and the power, the absolute power that both Mr. Burling and Sheila have over Eva Smith's fate. We also see another aspect of the town in Brumley. We see the women's charity organisation. So that suggests that there's a need for that. So we can establish from that women are poor and perhaps in need of help. And there are quite a few of those perhaps in the area. The girls' treatment shows that the poor can't depend on getting any help. So Eva Smith was not given the help that she needed, again, because of the whims of the rich and powerful in society. So thinking about the contrast between the power of the rich and their way of life and then the poor inhabitants of the town, and thinking about then how that's illustrated perhaps by their comfortable home, their elegant clothes and the fine food we see in the Burling household, in contrast with the shabby living conditions and the hunger endured by Eva Smith or Daisy Renton. You can see but there's that contrast there too. Also the fact that there's the Palace Bar, which feeds into this idea of women's place and especially poor women's place in this city. The fact that the Palace Bar is somewhere where people sort of know that you can go to pick up desperate women means that there has to be enough of that going on for it to have built up that reputation. It's just something to consider there. So, of course, we've mentioned about Burling and the fact that he had lots of women employed in his factory. But if we think about women and their place in society beyond factories, so their wider society, because Eva Smith represents and portrays exploitation in many aspects of life, not just in her workplace. And this is partly for her class and partly for her gender. And she's exploited by Mr. Burling in her work, and then she's exploited sexually by both Gerald and Eric because of her inferiority as a lower class woman in Edwardian society. So both Mrs. Burling and her daughter Sheila belong to a class of women who would never expect to have to work to provide for themselves. Each would have known while they were growing up they were destined to marry someone wealthy and then have a comfortable lifestyle provided for them. Girls born into upper and middle class families received an education that prepared them to become good wives and accomplished ornaments in their husbands' homes. So their biggest responsibility lay in managing staff, so they essentially were head of the household. And when young women failed to find a suitable husband, they remained in the parental home and were just supported by their father. So they were kind of safe no matter what. During the Edwardian period, the majority of women who had to work went into service as maids, cooks, laundry women, and then others like Eva Smith worked in factories or sweatshops, toiling away day after day for not very much, 22 and 6, a miserable wage. When Eva became Daisy Renton, she joined the ranks of thousands of women who were desperate enough to turn to prostitution to survive. And that's when Gerald discovers her at the Palace Music Hall bar, and that's where he describes that place as a favourite haunt of women of the town. And when we talked about Brumley earlier, this is what we mean, that there had to be enough women who were that desperate in that situation for that bar to have that reputation. Women's position in society had changed significantly by the time Priestley wrote the play. Although equality was still a long way off, there were still more opportunities for women in the workplace, and there were still people out there who were willing to exploit their fellow human beings and who didn't embrace some of the more socialist attitudes. But there would have been less reason for a parentless girl in 1945 to reach the point that Eva Smith, Daisy Renton did in 1912. Another point to consider is how that insular lifestyle of being a woman in 1912 meant a natural level of naivety and ignorance. If you think about the reactions that Mrs. Burling has towards Alderman Meggerty being called out for his behaviour, or Sheila not knowing where Gerald was that summer where he didn't come near her, the men were out living their lives and the women were almost willfully ignorant or incredibly naive in not in thinking about what they were doing and what they were getting up to. And this naive attitude also extends to Sheila when she's in Millwards, because she simply doesn't understand that Eva Smith needing that job was literally her livelihood. And by taking that job away from her, she is condemning her to a really terrible fate. She doesn't see that consequence because she's never experienced it herself. And that insular lifestyle means that she simply doesn't see those things. She doesn't understand the horrors of Mr. Burling's workplace. The men see it and turn a blind eye. The women turn a blind eye, but society also encourages them to do that. Dramatic context now. So around the time Priestley was writing, drama in Britain was largely aimed at the upper and middle classes who had the money and the leisure time to go to the theatre. If you think about it, that's not too dissimilar to now. Lots of theatre tickets are really expensive, and also, it requires a significant amount of time to go to the theatre. So even though it's not really aimed at the upper and middle classes now and anyone could go and enjoy the theatre, it's still quite an expensive pastime compared to other things. After the First World War, there were unsurprisingly a number of serious plays that took war as their major theme. One of the most enduring of these was Journey's End, which might be familiar to you, and that was written in this realistic style and attracted a lot of praise for its accurate portrayal of life and death and everything in between in the trenches at the Western Front. There were also light-hearted comedies of Noel Coward, something like Private Lives, both. And this kind of genre deals with the complicated marital relationships of the upper middle classes, where the comedy is based on these improbable situations and witty dialogue and jokes. So in the 30s and the 40s, a number of socialist theatre companies began to create drama to appeal to the working classes. So, for example, there were companies like the Red Megaphone, Unity Theatre, Theatre of Action, and they had this socialist political agenda. And they would take their drama to the streets or to the factory gates. And the idea was that they would promote these socialist ideals in front of the people to whom it mattered most. In other words, the working class, the workers, and encourage them to sort of be inspired to take action. So where does Priestley fit into this dramatic context? Well, his most successful plays weren't particularly considered controversial or radical in terms of their dramatic form. They largely took place in domestic settings, so like a living room or a dining room, and were presented in a realistic style. While Priestley did experiment with dramatic form, and he brought it together with things like music, ballet and masked characters in things like Johnson over Jordan in 1939, that was experimental and was not a commercial success. So he returned to more conventional dramatic style within Inspector Calls. It uses very traditional features which reflect other plays of the time, and it also harks back and has some connections to ancient Greek drama. So, for example, it has it takes place in real time. It has that traditional 3-act structure with the points of tension falling towards the end of each of the acts. And one of the key features that it borrows from ancient Greek drama is that we are told about some of the more unsavoury or upsetting parts of the action rather than being shown it on stage. So a really common convention of ancient Greek theatre is that if a character dies, then that happens off stage and we are told about it afterwards. So if you think about it, each of the characters tells us what happens after they have taken a part of Eva Smith's life from her. So that significance and connection to ancient Greek drama essentially connects them to that idea of something that's so horrific that it can't be shown on stage, so we have to be told about it instead. So if you're still listening, congratulations, you've made it through the mammoth marathon of an Inspector Calls context. Lots of different aspects of context explored here. There's, it's something that you could definitely explore further yourself, and each of these different areas you could explore further and have a look at some of the original documents and some more information about Priestley himself. But it certainly gives you an overview, and the key thing when it comes to context is linking it to the text. We are studying this for English literature. We're not studying it for history. So we don't want a history essay. We want to see how context influences texts and why certain decisions have been made in texts, and whether that has anything to do with the context around them. And Inspector Calls is so entrenched in its context that it's impossible to read and explore the play without exploring the events that lead up to it. So hopefully this is useful to you. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you for listening to Litcast, the podcast for GCSE and A-level revision. The music that you hear in this episode is called Galaxy and was written by Ixon, and you can find the rest of his music on SoundCloud. You can also find us on other social media channels, including YouTube, where you'll also find our Litcast live episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you again.